The Thin Edge series is being made possible by an underwriting grant from Bristol Myers Company.
From the time we're conceived, the biological forces of genetics and hormones and biochemistry are working to give us a sexual identity. From that moment on, we're male or female. But it isn't until after we're born that society teaches us what being a man or a woman really means.
I'm David Prowett. The miracle of conception and birth is followed by one of the most complex interactions of mind and body and society we ever experience. It's with us all our lives. It's the essence of you and me. It's sexuality, the human heritage, the first and most basic part of our identities as human beings as we spend our lives this side of the thin edge. Human sexuality is a fact of life, it's a state of mind, it's the most natural and fundamental part of our personality, one of the most joyous and troublesome parts of our lives, and consistently the most fascinating and controversial subject around today. Part of the confusion about our sexuality is that we're so uncomfortable as a society with sex, the act of sex itself. Virtually every highly organized society has wrapped sex up in a series of taboos and ethics and mystery. And so almost everyone is concentrated on that aspect of sexuality. And while no one would quarrel with its importance as both a lifetime source of joy and racial preservation and just plain fun, it really is just one part of being male and being female. Far more important to our mental health is the lifetime process of learning first our gender identity, our sense of being male or female, and then learning gender roles, the definition of what being male or female means in our society. And how we do this is a fascinating story. Of course, the first step is biological. We receive sex chromosomes from our parents, which control biochemical events, the production of certain hormones in utero that make us male or female. But it's really our experiences after we're born that are most crucial in establishing gender identity. Psychologists don't really know how the child integrates all his experience and forms this identity, but there are three major theories, and probably all three play some role. The first is social learning. Our society has certain expectations for masculine and feminine behavior, and we're rewarded for behavior appropriate to our sex and punished for behavior that's not appropriate. And by reinforcement, we gradually learn to practice the behavior that defines masculine or feminine in our society. The second is cognitive theory. The child is more than just a passive being responding to reward and punishment. He does think, and he can conceptualize. And he looks around and he finds out what boys and girls and men and women do and tries to imitate them. Finally, there's psychoanalytic theory. Freud made sexuality central to personality development. In this theory, each child is born with a fixed amount of sexual energy, and learning how to cope with it and the early conflicts with one's parents over sexuality appear to be critical in establishing gender identity. And so it's some combination of all of these that give us our basic sexual identity and the sense of masculinity or femininity that will be with us all our lives.
This learning process begins as soon as a baby begins to receive information from the outside world. And by the time it's 3 or 4, it knows firmly that it's a boy or a girl, and is well along in finding out all that implies. And nobody's smarter than a child in picking up this sort of information. It's survival material for a little boy to become a man and for a little girl to become a woman. And all of the culture is set to teach them these identities. One of the first things that they learn is that there are differences between boys and girls. How real these differences are and how children learn them are two of the questions being studied by Jerome Kagan, professor of developmental psychology at Harvard University.
There has been a lot of discussion about the possibility of basic biological differences between boys and girls regarding activity level. There's good reason to expect that there would be major differences because in primates, in monkeys, in general, there is much more rough and tumble play among the male of the species and among the female. That's rather reliable and certainly seems to be a fundamental biological difference. The differences among young boys and girls in the first 3 or 4 years of age is not as dramatic in humans as it is in monkeys, although in general, there's a slight tendency for boys to be a little more active, a little more vigorous than girls. But I think that difference is minimal in the first year or two and much greater toward years 3, 4, 5, 6. Notice after the boys begin to acquire their gender identity. Once he believes the category boy applies to him and the category girl applies to her, then the task is to be the very best boy you can and the very best girl you can be. Now, how do you determine what the best boy or the best girl is? You look around and see, A, what do boys and girls, males and females do? B, what do your parents, teachers, relatives tell you the ideal attributes of males and females are? And finally, what do the mass media tell you? Now, those, of course, are correlated, but there are differences among them. And then in a very creative, cognitive act, the child synthesizes those 3 sources of information and creates what some psychologists would call an ego ideal, an ideal standard. Who's nicer, boys or girls?
Girls.
Girls are nicer. Why is that? Why are girls nicer?
Because they don't play rough.
They don't play rough, right?
I don't play rough
Why do boys play rough, Jennifer? Why is that? Do you know?
because they just fight.
They fight a lot. Jennifer, do you know how boys play different?
From baseball.
They play baseball. What else do
They
boys
play
play?
football.
They play football.
Basketball.
What about girls? What do girls play?
They play tennis.
I see. Who do you think is smarter, boys or girls?
Boys.
Boys? Why is that? Why are boys smarter? Do you
Stop
know why?
it, sorrow.
Do you know why they are smarter? Who should look better, boys or girls? Girls should look better. Why is that?
Because they wear dresses and boys don't.
I see.
I grew up, I'll be a nurse.
Who are you more scared of? A girl you don't know or a boy you don't know?
I'm scared of monsters. I'm scared of monsters too. I'm not scared of boys.
Oh, that's good.
I'm not scared of boys. I'm scared of the monsters.
That's good. I used to be scared of monsters.
Now are you?
No, not anymore.
Have
But,
fun.
well, I found out there were no monsters.
We don't know it's not going to be a I saw a monster in my woods and he climbed over the fence.
Are monsters boys or girls?
Boys.
They are.
Boys.
There are no girl monsters. Who's stronger, boys or girls?
Boys.
And strength is symbolically associated with power. Power is a metaphor for strength in many ways. And so when the concept of power enters the child's mind during latency and adolescence, the earlier conviction that males were generally stronger than females leads them easily to conclude, unconsciously of course, that when it comes to power, males are likely to have more of it than females, especially in a male-female encounter. Boys have more muscle mass per body weight than girls do, and though you can find girls who are bigger and stronger than boys, in general, there are more boys that are stronger than girls, and it's that difference which is slight when you're younger, a little greater during adolescence, that is fed into the cognitive machine the child has, and even though the difference absolutely isn't that great, it is perceived to be greater than it is. It's magnified. It is very important to understand the meaning of psychological statements that say males are more aggressive than females, females are more nurturant than males. The average person who hears that thinks that means that all around the world, no matter where you see males, they will be more aggressive than females and vice versa for nurturance. That's not what the statement means. What it means is that within a particular culture, it is likely that the males will be more aggressive than the females, the females more nurtured than the males. Let me give you an example. American males are generally more aggressive than American females. But American females are a lot more aggressive than Japanese females. It's not that females are not aggressive. In general in America, and this is not true in all societies, in America, girls are much freer to go back and forth than boys are. So you'll see girls, on the average, engaging in more male and female activities than you will see boys engaging in male and female activities. Each sex has its own special joys, privileges, responsibilities, anxieties. It's a little like comparing apples and oranges.
But these differences in our culture aren't just a product of early learning. They're part of an ongoing socialization process that prepares us for the many roles society wants us to play. One of the most powerful of these roles is that of the married person, becoming formally part of a family. We are one of the most married cultures in the world. The 1970 census shows that better than 95% of American adults eventually get married. In the last few years, despite the pressures for social change, that figure has dropped less than 2%. What creates this powerful need for marriage? Where does it come from? And how closely is the phenomenon tied to our ideas of masculinity and femininity? Carl Fred Broderick, professor of sociology at the University of Southern California, studied more than 6,000 youngsters over a 6-year period to find some answers.
We found out that even in the 4th grade, the most important element in masculinity and femininity was the idea that someday they might get married. Did any of you remember the earliest time you ever had a boyfriend or a girlfriend? As somebody you had a crush on as a kid?
Me and this cousin of mine were about 4 or 5 years old. I don't think I was starting school yet. And all of a sudden we found ourselves, somebody said, why don't you kiss her, So I kissed her, and all of a sudden my aunt comes out with, I now pronounce you man and wife, and that's, pretty direct. We were already married at 3 years old.
I know my little sister. She's got a 4-year-old boyfriend next door that, she calls herself Karen Fusato, and just, that's the way it is. They're already married. That's the way it's going to be. And
I thought maybe we might talk a little bit about how people learn to be feminine, to walk the way girls walk, and to use gestures the way girls use gestures, and to use vocal expressions the way girls do, and to have the feelings, attitudes, and whatever that girls have in our society, and how they learn to be guys.
I ran around like a little tomboy, and I had short hair, and sometimes I didn't even know I was a girl. My parents didn't really seem to think it was that bad that I did that. In fact, they kind of encouraged it in a way. And then, as I've been growing up, I just kind of turned to be more feminine because I found I couldn't get guys if you weren't feminine.
My mom and dad started me out in tap dancing, ballet school, 3rd grade, and I had to learn all these little things in charm school and things like that, but it was never really enforced of what I was supposed to be, or feminine or masculine, though I did climb trees. We had a playhouse, so we did play Army too, but they tended to give me Barbie dolls and my dancing lessons.
Have any of you ever done what I've seen my kids do? Stand in front of a mirror and practice saying really sophisticated things to the other person. Maybe none of you have ever done that.
I used to do, in front of the mirror, I'd practice being more masculine and everything.
Yeah.
And I'd stick my chest out, and I would, do that, and I would, walk around and try to...
Like keep the hips narrow.
I would do that, I remember.
I tried to once. It just didn't work out.
All this is rehearsal, and then finally comes a time, though, when you're really faced with the reality of a date. Maybe you remember your very first time that you ever were alone with a member of the opposite sex, and all the rehearsing and all the fantasies and all, here it was, the real thing. Anybody remember that?
I remember, because I really didn't know what to do, and I remember the first girl I ever had, it was more like a friendship thing, and later I found out from another guy that she wanted me to, hold her hand a lot more and kiss her and all that.
You got your script too late after you were over.
I felt awkward, holding her hand and all that. I felt uncomfortable, but yet, see, she was the first girlfriend that I had, like in junior high, but I remember when I was in 3rd grade, I had girls follow me and I used to kiss them and all that, but I didn't feel anything. But then later on in junior high, I did feel something.
I guess with me, I can I can converse with a girl, you know, fairly well, and I don't, you know, perspire and break down and everything. But, you know, once it comes to the moment of truth, I would guess, you know, you just sort of, you know, fall apart at the seams. I don't know, you know, maybe it's just me, but I think that a lot of it is people who, you know, read their McCall's magazine, find out that there's a new sexuality, and they decide, I'm a member, you know, I'm going to get caught smack dab in the sexual revolution. I'm not going to be a prisoner of war.
If the pressure on youth to get married has remained a fairly constant factor in our culture, the pressure for early sexual experience has mushroomed. The pill, Supreme Court decisions on freedom of sexual information, a generally more tolerant attitude on the part of society, media exploitation, all of these factors have put heavy pressure on young people to have early sex before many of them really want it or can handle it. How do they feel about it? Adelaide Jacquet, Social Services Director of Planned Parenthood of New York City, talks with a group of 17 and 18-year-olds.
Well, we're talking here about sex as if sex is very free. I mean, do you really feel that it's really that accepted and people just have sex before they get married these days?
Definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely no.
Yeah, come on. This is 1975. I do. I think that, and I think it's good this way. We're constantly being bombarded by sex everywhere you go. You know, the advertisements for cars in which they have a gorgeous, sexy creature sitting on the car helping to sell it. I mean, it's everywhere, all over the place. You know, and if you're not constantly thinking about sex or having it, you feel as though almost as though there's something wrong with you. You know, because society seems to be going in this direction. I have to be sort of seductive, I guess, and also to you know, to be active and aggressive also. But I really don't consider it that much of pressure because I enjoy it.
Yeah.
You know, it's something I want to do.
Yeah. We're talking about, you know, contraception. What about if you didn't use contraception and you decided that you were having sex?
Sometimes that kind of takes the spontaneity out of the situation.
Yeah.
And that's something that's very important to a lot of people. You know, especially, let's say, the first time you're having sex. You know, you want it to be romantic and spontaneous, and, you know, it just sort of happens,
Yeah.
you know, and to have contraception and to have it planned just sort of ruins it and puts it in a different light.
Yeah.
You know, and
Because I think that you're
really
living
don't
for the
think
moment,
about,
you know? You really don't think about contraception until either after you get pregnant or after you think you're pregnant and your period hasn't come for a while. The idea of contraception really hit me after I found out. I said, wow, you know, I'm pregnant. Now I really have to do something about it. I knew that it could happen, all right? I didn't believe it, though.
Well, when you're an adolescent, obviously your sexual drives start to develop. And outwardly, I think boys are supposed to have more of a sexual drive and always want sex and let's go. But when it comes down to it, I would say that guys and girls, in an intimate relationship, in a one-on-one basis, really have the same sexual drive. It's just that the male shows it more.
I'm not sure that's always true, though, because I found that until, like, the past couple of years, until about 2 years ago, my sexual drives were never as strong as the guys. And I always found that they couldn't understand how I could just, you know, I wasn't as, you know, as motivated or turned on, and I could just stop. After getting involved, at a certain point, I could just sort of roll over and go to sleep, you know, and they would be very upset, you know. And I didn't realize because their sexual drives are much more developed.
The biggest peer group pressure I have right now for males is to have sex. That is the big thing. If you don't go out on the weekend and have sex, well,
You didn't have a very good weekend.
yes, definitely. And
You couldn't have done too well.
you'd be very surprised at all the people who lie about their sexual activity
Yeah,
just for the
fine.
fact that peer group pressure. Right.
But I think
Right.
that's more for a guy. I think for girls have another kind of peer group pressure. And the peer group pressure that I find I'm under is that is to really get involved with somebody. And that, you know, sort of being labeled as a kind of a slut if you're not, if you don't get very intensely involved, and if you just have sort of casual sexual relationships, that is frowned upon for women.
Yeah, it is.
For girls.
It is. Yeah. Like women too, it is.
Well, the pressure that you get from your parents, I think, is totally different than what you get from your peer group. Your parents bring their biases or unconsciously tell you their biases towards sex. And what it usually is, at least I find in my case, is not to have it or to refrain from having it until you're married, which was the attitude 30 or 40 years ago. And
Sure. You don't think it's changed with them, though? Because I think a lot of parents have learned to accept it. You know, and especially with guys, they think, well, a lot of people I know sort of have this double standard thing that they expect it from their male children, whereas not from the female children.
it's the old double standard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It still exists, even though most people would say it doesn't. It still does.
One problem with teenage sexuality that has not only remained with us, but is growing every year, is the number of out-of-wedlock pregnancies. Since 1940, the annual number of live births in the United States has risen 23%. But among unmarried teenagers, it's risen to 323%. In 1974, there were an estimated 608,000 pregnancies among unmarried teenagers. Of course, this is the time when sexuality becomes a major factor in the development of our gender identity. Learning how to handle this as part of growing up is a uniquely human problem. All other species have their drives completely or mostly handled by a psychic remote control called instinct. They don't have to think about them. As a matter of fact, for the most part, they can't. When a female rat goes into heat, her tiny, primitive brain sends out signals for the hormonal activity that forces her to mate with any male in the vicinity. The rat male, presented with a receptive female, is driven to mount her. Monkeys, whose brains are considerably more sophisticated than a rat's, do show some preference for partners, do exhibit some variation in receptivity, but are most receptive when they're fertile. Hormones are still very important in controlling their sexual behavior. But for us, it's a whole different story. The human female is receptive at any time, and she's most responsive at a time when she's not fertile. Because of this unique thinking mechanism, the brain, we can choose our partners, and words like love and friendship come into play, separating us forever from the simple instinctual sex behavior of the animal. Not that drives and hormone triggers aren't there in humans, they are. But they're so much less important in influencing our behavior than they are in animals that they're hardly worth comparing. But the role of hormones is crucial in determining our sex and in influencing our susceptibility for certain types of masculine or feminine behavior. At conception, the fertilized egg contains all the information to create a male or a female. The first thing that's needed for a male is for the egg to receive the Y chromosome from the father. That, in turn, activates the formation of male testes in the embryo. When these are formed, they're triggered to send out the male hormone androgen to form the external genitals and another substance to stop the female organs from developing. Finally, the androgen hits the central nervous system. Scientists don't yet know exactly how, but they believe it acts in some way at a critical period to lay down predispositions for masculine behavior. And so, you've got a male instead of a female. By the way, this whole question about how influential early hormonal activity is in creating behavior patterns in humans and animals is under study by a number of researchers.
The role of hormones in creating masculine and feminine behavior in rats is critical while the fetus is being formed. Minute changes in the hormones in the pregnant rat's blood can confuse later sexual behavior in the offspring. And these hormonal changes, in rats at least, can be caused by simply subjecting the mother animal to unnatural stress during her pregnancy. Ingeborg Ward, Associate Professor of Psychology at Villanova University, explains.
We've been interested in the process of sexual differentiation for a long time, and specifically in various prenatal factors that seem to exert such a critical role in the ultimate organization of adult sexual behaviors. This is one of the experiments that we've recently completed. We are looking at a pregnant rat under stress by being confined daily for 45 minutes, 3 times a day, during the last week of pregnancy. We're not entirely sure of all the physiological changes that are going on inside of the mother, but we believe that the reaction of the mother to being stressed somehow is translated into a decrease in testosterone levels in her male fetuses. When we observed our experimental animals, we found that the prenatally stressed males failed to show male copulatory behavior when placed together with receptive females. Male fetuses require the presence of androgen in utero in order to be properly masculinized. The present research seems to indicate that prenatal stress acting on the mother is sufficient to alter the hormonal conditions of the male fetuses in utero at the time to cause permanent alterations in their adult sexual behavior.
While Dr. Ward's work establishes the tremendous prenatal influence of sex hormones in determining the sexual behavior of lower animals, their influence in humans is considerably more tenuous. John Money, professor of medical psychology and associate professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, believes that the role of prenatal hormones in human beings is more in laying the groundwork for thresholds in adult life, predispositions for certain behaviors.
Parentism is simply the behavior of taking care of little children. And I use that word instead of maternalism because you can get parentalism in both sexes. And the difference is in the threshold for its emergence or manifestation. And that's beautifully illustrated in a monkey experiment that was done at the University of Davis by Mitchell and his group. And there they found that if you take a male monkey who usually doesn't like to pay much attention to little babies, and every day you put a little baby with him for a while, first he is indifferent and neglects it, but the baby keeps repeatedly trying to get his attention and to grab onto him and hug him. And after a few days, he begins to show exactly the same kind of caretaking behavior as the female does. But it takes a few days. And when you're dealing with a female, it takes a few moments. I think the explanation of the difference between the sexes is in the matter of threshold. Another one's got to do with marking out or mapping out of territory, which has got something to do with space perception. And I picked that up because it just may possibly be a basis to the observation that has been well documented by school teachers and psychologists that in today's schools, boys are better at spatial relationships in mathematics than girls are. The other side of that coin is that girls are better, on the average, at language arts. Well, I have a little science fiction that might show where that foundation lies, too. And that is that in the female of the species, there's a greater sensitivity to the sound of the young when they need care, when they're newborn and soon thereafter. There may be a fine-tuning that makes the threshold easier for them to get over when it comes to verbal learning, and it may be based on the sensitivity to the sounds of the young. That's something that will need some experimental work to either prove it or disprove it. Now, if you want to understand the relationship of hormones to behavior now in adolescence or adulthood, you must turn back the clock and try and understand the story of the prenatal period. Prenatal hormones lay dispositions for the formation of gender identity, but they absolutely do not preordain what's going to happen after you're born. It is only a predisposition, and the final determinant of which way the development of masculinity or femininity, or the content of what constitutes masculinity or femininity, is going to be determined by social events in postnatal life. The imbalance of hormones at puberty creates some debate among experts and among lay people too. I think the commonest source of that debate is in the idea, the hankering, I might almost say, to believe that hormones would cure wrong attitudes. The idea here is that having the outlook of a male as a product of androgen and having the outlook of a female as a product of estrogen, well, that attitude is just hopelessly too simple-minded. It gets applied in the simple-minded idea that you could cure homosexuality if you still belong to the crowd of people who think it's a disease. You could cure it by injecting the person with male hormone. Well, that absolutely is not true. All that happens when you do that is that the body has to get rid of the excess amount that you put in, and so it gets rid of it in its own normal way, which is to spill it out in the urine. It's useful to give hormone supplements to people only when their own bodies are not making enough, and that's true for male or female. You can have behavior cemented into your system, even if it was socially learned, just as well as if it were put there from the program in your chromosomes and genes or in the program from your prenatal hormones. That's why most people have the feeling that their gender identity is so fixed and so definite and so imperative a part of themselves that it must have been put in there by biology, because they can't imagine that it could have been learned in there.
While the exact role that hormones play in the development of our sexual identities isn't fully known, we have learned that there is no simple answer to the question of how our sexual preferences are developed. Alfred Kinsey created a scale to measure preferences during his pioneering research. On his scale, an exclusively heterosexual man or woman rated 0, an exclusively homosexual man or woman a 6. According to Alan Bell, senior research psychologist at the Institute for Sex Research in Bloomington, Indiana, an estimated 5% of U.S. males and 2.5% of U.S. females are fully homosexual. Here he meets with 2 male and 1 female homosexual.
From our own and other people's data, it's becoming increasingly clear that there are many different ways to become homosexual, just as there are many different ways to become heterosexual. And when we look at the development of sexual orientation and of our sexual personhood, it's important to look at relationships that one has with one's mother, with one's father, with siblings, with peers, influences outside the home, that all of these very important early relationships as well as subsequent relationships in adolescence and young adulthood have a very important shaping influence on how we experience ourselves as sexual beings.
Homosexuality, lesbianism to me is so natural. It's, as natural as any developmental stage in my life, like learning to walk.
I'm perfectly happy as a homosexual, and I only speak to the problem of oppression and unhappiness because I see it in other people, and I don't think they should have to go through this at all.
Homosexual man has the same preferences as the heterosexual man. The only difference is his choice of partners.
Another stereotype is that homosexuals have never experienced any kind of heterosexual arousal or never had heterosexual involvements, or that all homosexuals really wish they could become heterosexual, if given just half a chance, if only they could become heterosexual.
I've read statistics that, and I can believe that most lesbians have been married. So that lesbians have experience relating to men and find it insufficient. And I don't just mean they're not sexually fulfilled by their husbands, but there's a whole world that's missing, and they know it. And they seek other women, and they want the support of other women.
How do you account for that?
I think women are better at relationships, and I think women know how to make a relationship work. And a relationship with 2 women is, pretty good odds that it'll be okay.
Fran, are you saying when you comment about women being more capable of having relationships, do you think this is a capacity that they're born with, that men aren't capable under different circumstances of also having valid relationships or giving to other people as much as women do?
No, I don't think women are born better at relationships with people. I think that they're socialized to be better as part of the subservience that's socialized into them. And conversely, men are socialized not to value other people, perhaps to be more competitive, more ruthless, and
In study after study, it would appear
among non-clinical samples that homosexuals and heterosexuals can't be distinguished on the basis of their psychological adjustment. There's every reason to believe, at least on the data that I've seen, when it's not based on clinical samples or on prison samples, that homosexuality is not ipso facto pathological.
But a gay is told that nothing they do sexually or emotionally is right. And this contributes to the horrible self-oppression and self-hate that occurs. And then when people see that in homosexuals, they go back to the old stereotype that there's something about being gay in itself that makes you unhappy, and it's not. It's merely the lies that we have been fed, and unfortunately we have believed too.
Homosexuals differ from each other in much the same way that heterosexuals differ from each other. For example, there's some homosexuals who are exclusively homosexual. In other words, they're sixes on the so-called Kinsey scale. They've been exclusively homosexual all their lives, while there are other homosexuals, male and female, who have had extensive heterosexual experience and who can respond heterosexually and score lower on that Kinsey scale. So they're different in terms of their sexual orientation. And what I'm really getting at is that maybe certain heterosexuals would be more comfortable and happy as homosexuals, given their developmental experiences, and that certain homosexuals may really, given their developmental sequence, be happier in a heterosexual orientation.
This idea of different thresholds for different behaviors in men and women appears to be a unifying concept for human beings. We're all capable of similar responses, just at different levels and perhaps different strengths. How much these levels in adult men and women are determined by biology and how much by experience isn't really known, but they are there. A few other differences brought out in our research that you might not have considered. Women have cyclical fertility. Men are fertile all the time. Women have an extra layer of fatty tissue that enables them to withstand cold and temperature changes better than men, possibly a protection for the fetus when she's pregnant. Women are more sensitive to touch than men, and women are less prone to serious disease at any stage in their lives. All of these findings, remember, are based on an average, and there will be exceptions, sometimes a lot of them. But in general, these characteristics will hold true. Women are more susceptible to alcohol. It's speculated that this might be caused by their bodies containing less water than men, and the alcohol is less diluted. Women can stand longer periods of time at repetitive tasks. Women go through greater mood swings than men do. Now, this could be hormonal, or it could be the cultural approval to do it. And women are less erotically aroused by visual material than men. You'll note that none of these things have anything to do with intelligence or perception. They're just differences. Another area of differences, which has been under much discussion recently, is the need for masculine and feminine roles. Some things to remember in looking at roles are that, first, we all play them. Secondly, most of us have several of them. And thirdly, they can be changed. They can be changed because we play them against the scenario of the culture we live in, and that culture changes. And nowhere is that possibility for change more evident than in the study of the role of the family in other cultures. That's the work of Eleanor Leacock, chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the City College of New York.
The family that we're used to and that we almost accept as universal is, of course, the so-called nuclear family with the father, the mother, and the children living together. We accept this as so universal that we, in fact, and even some anthropologists do this, tend to project it onto society as a whole. Everywhere we look, we see nuclear families as the basic unit. The fact is that among hunters and gatherers and early agricultural societies, the nuclear family is not the basic unit. It's the group of 3 or 4 families that live together that are the basic unit. Everybody worked together. Everybody shared the products of the hunt, shared the food. And we find that the fact that women bore the children really didn't have a great deal to do with the equality of their status. The whole group took responsibility for the children, and there were no basic inequalities in the roles of men and women. In the process of developing larger groupings living together, class differences arose. In place of the group where everybody is dependent upon each other and sharing the food, you begin to have these ties of trade linking people with outside groups. And you get a shift in that fundamental communal structure and a new developing public domain, and along with it then goes the political, the warfare, areas where important decisions are made that are quite different from that of the actual household group itself. The question then arises that given this development of a public-private dichotomy, why the men, why not the women? Aren't we just coming full circle back to the fact that since the women have the children, this is the cause of their lower status? The role of the men in warfare, in trade, seems to be extremely important here, obviously. And true, these were the areas that followed from the hunt, that were the areas that the men worked in. The point is that it isn't having the children that causes the lower status. It's something that happened to the family that made the difference. You had the development of an individual family structure where the women and the children are actually dependent upon the individual man. It would be a luxury to think of defining roles under such situations. Obviously, people had enormous difficulty being men, being women, being human in these kinds of struggles for survival. So in a sense, there's a luxury to our discussion today, our exploration of our roles as men and women.
Hello, this is Sam, Save a Marriage. Can I help you?
One of the most profound results of this newfound luxury is a virtual doubling of the number of divorced people in our society. They don't stay divorced, they just change partners, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But the pressures on marriage have created a growing need for new and different kinds of marriage counseling services like this one. Dr. Laura Singer, a marriage and family counselor herself and past president of the American Association of Marriage and Family Counselors, has been thinking about the new problems for a long time.
I believe that we have not explored marriage sufficiently, that we have felt constrained and tied into traditional aspects of marriage, that now we're beginning to find out that it's possible for a man to stay home and for a woman to go to work, for a man to nurture and raise a child, and for a woman to be the breadwinner. We are discovering that it's possible to have a variety of experiences that can enhance and enrich a relationship. And I think that we're beginning to be more free to be able to say, look, we don't know the answers. We've got to find other ways of being together, other ways of living, other ways of relating, that the traditional ways are not working now. They don't work in a technological age, in an age in which there is such rapid and enormous social change.
This whole business of relating to one another in a marriage is becoming harder. The rules are changing, and a lot of the institutions we depended on for support don't have the same influence our mothers and fathers were able to count on. Divorce laws have eased. Families are smaller and more often childless. Women can earn their own living with more ease. Social pressure for being married is less. Sound like a revolution is here? Well, it really isn't. People are getting married, and people are raising families, and people are managing to stay together. But there are some changes. Pat and Cliff Chieffo have been married for 16 years. They have 2 girls, and they both work.
Both of us had a chance to establish careers, mine in the museum field and Cliff in teaching field. So when we finally decided that we would like to have a family, we had a long, serious talk about the fact that I really couldn't see putting my career aside. It was established, it was enjoyable, I really cared about it. What would we do? And so at that time, Cliff was working 5 days a week, as I was myself. And we decided, well, perhaps, first of all, I decided maybe I should do the traditional thing and stay home with the baby, because perhaps I really would like it. It's the kind of thing my mother did, it was the kind of thing his mother did, and I did stay home during the first 8 months that Nina was born. But it was a disaster.
It was awful.
I was unhappy. I waited for him to come home. I used to question him about what he was doing at work. His life seemed stimulating. Mine was very dull. And we said, perhaps there's a need for both of us to pursue the kind of thing we do best.
I think most guys really are hung up on a macho thing, you know, a real superman hang-up. And I really have found that it's really, it does not diminish, so-called masculinity, if you work at the house, in the house, take care of the kids. I could never understand that. To me, it seems this is as normal as anything. And since we both have the children, there's no reason why one person should get all the joys and agonies. But Pat does the cooking, and then also the laundry.
He does the cleaning of the house. We don't have a housekeeper. I thought that's important to say, that we clean our own house. Also, he does the bills. I can't stand writing out checks or taking care of bills, and so that he spends time doing that kind of thing. Actually, we try to do the things that we enjoy the most, or at least don't mind doing very much. And somehow that's the way things have sort of settled out. Cliff and I have a mutual respect for each other. We also have respect for each other's careers. And he's my best friend, and that makes a big difference.
Strange as it may seem.
But you do. You take care of your best friend. And we also saw advantages. There were, not everybody has a husband like mine. When Nina was sick, I really didn't like staying up and rocking her in the rocking chair. In a way, if you're talking about being maternal, Cliff is really much more maternal than I am. He sat every night in a chair for a year and a half and rocked her. I wouldn't do that. That was a terrific sacrifice.
Well, I have 2 brothers. She has 2 sisters. And they all have very normal type relationships, in terms of...
Normal life patterns.
Lifestyles. The husband works and the wife stays home.
They think that we're wacko. I think that because we're the babies of the family, we're the 2 youngest children, they think that we're a slightly oddball in comparison to the rest of the family. But sometimes I just feel I don't have enough time, and I wish I could put in 5 days. And I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one of the problems. I think we also agree that if we didn't have the kids now, we would be really on easy street because we can both work as much or as little as we liked.
I think as we get older, we get better in every way. I mean, really, I think we look better, and I think we like each other more.
That's true.
Things are easier. And also, Cliff's
easier in the later years.
And he's not a macho type, so that he shares in the bedroom as he shares in every place else. I mean, he's really terrific.
Gosh.
So roles and self-perceptions of our sexual identity do change, but really, how much and how fast? The Kiefos feel secure in their identities as a man and a woman. And in the roles that they've chosen, neither feels threatened, neither feels a loss of that precious gender identification. And that identification is with us, remember, from the time we're born until the time we die. There are milestones along the way, psychological ones like learning our label as a boy or a girl, finding out what it means, trying to match our needs with society's expectations, learning to live with our sexual identity, and then, of course, fighting to keep it in our old age. And there are the physiological benchmarks. Hormones that make us male or female, puberty, where all the secondary sex characteristics appear, and for women, menopause. For some, one of the most frightening times in their life, for others, just another moment in growing as adults. Dr. Estelle Ramey, professor of physiology and biophysiology at the Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., explains what this natural phenomenon means.
Well, menopause is considered to be the time at which menses stop. The woman doesn't have periods anymore. But in actual fact, the menopause is really more complicated than that. And many women have the symptoms of the menopause while they're still having regular menstrual periods. As a result, they become frightened because they think that some other disease has afflicted them, when in actual fact, they're simply going through the preliminary stages of a drop-off in ovarian hormones. The thing that we all must remember about hormones is that the human brain is far more potent in determining sensations and behavior than the hormones as such. And I might say, incidentally, that during the period in which a woman is going through the menopause, other hormones other than her ovarian hormones are being altered in their ratio. For example, while she may be manufacturing as much thyroid hormone as she did before, that thyroid hormone isn't as effective as it used to be in generating energy in the body. And men suffer during the aging period precisely the same changes. They don't get the response to thyroid hormone that they used to get when they were young. Their energy responses have changed. They're getting a gradual but very real drop-off in their own sex hormones, not as abruptly as women do, but nevertheless a very real thing, and some men may get a very significant drop-off. And so these are real physical phenomena, and women must know that there are ways of dealing with this on a physical basis. There are hormone supplements that physicians can use for women to tide them over this period, or perhaps to maintain them on it for very long periods of time. But at any rate, this must not simply be brushed off as simply another aspect of the things that American women dream up to make life a misery for American men. They are real, but they can be handled. It's rather shocking that so few women really know what to anticipate.
My blood pressure would go up at times, and then that weak, funny spell, I began to wonder there was something wrong with my brain or something.
Did you think you were in the menopause?
No, because I've still been having periods fairly regular. I never had any problems otherwise. It never entered my mind.
You think of yourself as less of a woman?
No, it hasn't bothered me anyway, because I've always looked on that as a natural thing. You cannot get out of it. I mean, you have to live with it, and it hasn't bothered me. I'll be glad if it's all over with myself.
So you see yourself as just as much of a woman as you ever were?
Sure. Start living a little bit different, maybe.
The menopause may bring with it a kind of relief. The relief from the monthly periods, which can be somewhat handicapping in some ways, or relief from the danger of pregnancy. And certainly it brings with it a sense in the healthy woman of having completed one phase of her life. And if the society is prepared to say to her, you are now just beginning another important phase of your life. You're 45, and you have probably 30 more years ahead of you, good, solid years, where you don't have to concern yourself with the problems of youth, then I think you can look on the bright side of this, and it need not be a catastrophe.
The Psalms promised us 70 relatively good years. We were also taught to respect our elders. We also learned they were repositories of knowledge and wisdom. Unfortunately, there aren't many references to regarding them as people, and people whose sexual identities and desires are still very much there, if society will allow them to be. Old age sometimes means infirmity, sometimes illness, certainly a lessening of energy. But it doesn't make a man less of a man or a woman less of a woman. Michael and Ursel Heath, who have been married for 18 months, are both in their 60s.
It's just one of those things that you feel. I don't know. It's hard to explain. The magnetism which just expresses itself when you're near someone that you love.
A lot of people would say, well, how can you enjoy it? So what are you getting married for? There's nothing there, you know. But they just don't know. They just don't know how much love and affection there is there. And when you have love and affection, then there is sex.
It gets better as you get older.
The Heaths are lucky. In their age group, the number of widows and single women outnumber widowers and single men by a huge factor. Just finding a partner is hard. And those that don't are often condemned to another kind of loneliness, the loneliness of having society take their sexual identities away. One of the leading researchers in the field is Dr. Eric Pfeiffer, professor of psychiatry and associate director of the Center for the Study of Aging at Duke University.
Sexuality is kind of a new topic to be talking about in terms of older people, because for many years, most people assumed that older people either didn't have any sexual interests or activities, or if they said that they did, they were liars or perverts or something of that sort. And I think we learned some rather surprising things. One is that we found that many older people, men and women in their 60s and 70s and 80s, were still quite interested in sexual activity, had a lot of sexual interest, and many of them engaged in fairly regular sexual intercourse. Elderly people themselves, some of them are sort of surprised that it's all right for them to have sexual feelings. For the most part, there isn't really any biological limit set to their sexuality. Men are slower to reach erection, but they're also slower to ejaculate, and so that actually sexual intercourse might be prolonged over a greater period of time as compared with younger men. For the women, I would say the major changes relate to the loss of estrogen. And in this regard, I think we would feel rather strongly at this point that any woman who wishes to continue an active sexual life should probably be on replacement estrogen therapy following menopause. But the point I'd like to make is that many illnesses that interfere with sexual expression in later life are temporary, and that sexual expression can be resumed afterwards. You can't wear sex out by using it, essentially. And by using it, you're likely to retain your capacity for it, which may be good news.
A chapter in the story of our human sexuality, some of what we know, and an indication of how far we are from understanding the whole phenomenon of our development as male and female. Why do we know so little? Why is this fundamental area of human development so neglected by basic science? Well, part of the reason may be that our sexual identity is so personal, so much a part of us, so vital to our own self-esteem, our self-image, that the idea of examining it too closely is frightening. But one thing seems clear. Without an understanding of how we acquire and maintain our sexual identities, what forces, both biological and psychological, are involved in shaping us as masculine or feminine, tampering with those forces could be a very dangerous business. A danger that can only be averted by cutting through the myth and misinformation and rhetoric about human sexuality and replacing them with real knowledge about one of the most important, most fascinating, and most potentially rewarding parts of our human heritage. Thank you for being with us. This is David Prowett. Goodbye.
The Thin Edge series has been made possible by an underwriting grant from Bristol Myers Company.